So, my friends, welcome to Significancy. At these events, we try to introduce topics. Usually, this is what we try to do, a topic that is a little edgy or even provocative at times. Tonight is something very different. Tonight, this is going to be deeply real. I pray tonight that this is a place of peace and love for you. Surely there's a lot of loss in this room, so this isn't a typical Significancy. But we will have a wonderful talk and a chance to interview our guests tonight. Some wonderful live music. Perhaps the oddest line in our Bible is, "Blessed are those who mourn." I mean, you could translate that in Greek as, "Happy are those who are sad." What does that mean? I mean, when he says that, what does he mean? Or you could translate it, "Congratulations, you are mourning." What does he mean? Happy are the sad? I suppose if you really tried to delve into it, you might say that it's through our sadness we discover some of the deepest love in life. I mean, you could begin to heap even more platitudes on it to try to make sense of it, that there has to be sadness to be joy, and I suppose you could try to make sense of it. But I think mostly he was just trying to love those around him, because the full line is, "Blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted." So I hear it more as just an expression of his love for us. Remember, he goes on to lose a friend that he loved, Lazarus, and that's the one moment in the Bible that he weeps. Now, he raises Lazarus from the dead. Now, I get this. He lost someone he loved. He raised them from the dead. Wouldn't that be the dream? I mean, isn't that the dream? He raised them from the dead, and he had the person he loved back. But I got to tell you, I don't fully understand that, because a lot of other people had lost folks that he didn't bring back. I get that he loved Lazarus, but I don't know how to do the calculus there emotionally. But who am I to question his love? I want to begin the evening with an image. I actually share this image a lot, but it always means something different to me. When I used to live in San Francisco and I needed to decompress, I would go over the Golden Gate Bridge, and there's a redwood forest there, Muir Woods, and it's spectacular. Raise your hand if you've been to Muir Woods. Yeah, it's spectacular, isn't it? So I just would walk among those giant trees, and it was so peaceful. I could find myself there. And those redwood trees soar impossibly to the sky. I mean, they're amazingly tall. And one day I saw on the base of one of those mammoth trees a little sign that explained how it is a redwood can grow that tall and strong. It said that, in fact, in a redwood grove, every one of those trees has entwined their roots with one another. So, in essence, they're leaning upon each other. That's why they can grow so tall. And that's become a very vivid image for me for church or community, where we can entwine our roots, know each other, and then lean upon each other. I imagine, as a pastor of a church, that this is a place like a redwood grove where we can know each other, and people get to share their stories again and again, and then lean upon each other. I know, in fact, our guest has an important memory around redwood trees in her own life. Let's be a redwood forest tonight. We're here in the fullness of life. Let's lean upon each other. We're here in the fullness of life. Let's be tall, strong, and hopeful. We're going to begin with a song from Will Hutchinson. It's called Just a Bird. It's just about a bird, and a bird that wants to somehow keep singing. It's not easy to always keep singing. This bird just wants to be able to breathe. It's not always easy to keep singing. The bird just wants to breathe and sing.
Oh, I'm just a bird on a power line, singing to myself and the quiet sky. Fall has fallen, I forgot to fly south on the wind to paradise. They tell me that my dreams have flown beneath my feet, but this I won't believe, so I'll keep on singing my sweet melody. Oh, I'm just a bird flying 9 to 5, singing to myself and wasting time. The stronger birds are out of sight. I'm shopping for my collar and tie. They tell me that my dreams have flown beneath my feet, but this I won't believe, so I'll keep on singing my sweet melody. Oh, I will flap my wings like a mockingbird in spring. I will never cease to sing as long as I can breathe. I can breathe. Let me breathe. Let me. Oh, I'm just a bird with doors open wide. No ceiling could ever hide the azure skies nested in my eyes. I'm on my way to paradise. They tell me that my dreams have flown beneath my feet, but this I won't believe. I'll keep on singing my sweet melody. Yes, I'll keep on singing my sweet melody. Keep on singing your sweet melody.
So, I've been reading Hope Edelman lately, just finished After Grief, and there is, well, such a humanity in that book. That when someone mixes kindness with intellect, that's a powerful thing, and it's so human in that book. So I've had in years past people that have read Motherless Daughters. It was so pivotal. Yeah, I remember. And it was so pivotal in their lives. So we have a special guest tonight. She's written plenty of books. She's been everywhere, but maybe more importantly, she's created a network now of support groups and retreats and taking care of people. So tonight we get to spend some time with Hope Edelman. Will you join me in welcoming her? Is that the right height?
Yep, I think that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. You can all hear me okay? The mic's working well? How lovely to be here with you tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Keck, for the beautiful introduction. I'm going to depart from script for a moment just to mention the redwoods that you brought up, because the redwoods were such an important metaphor when I was writing Motherless Daughters. I wrote that book when I was in my late 20s. It's going to be celebrating its 30th anniversary next month, 30 years in print, 30 years of Motherless Daughters. I've since updated it several times, but I was just a little pipsqueak when I wrote that book, and I was up in Northern California, and a therapist who I was interviewing, who was a relative of someone very dear to me, said, hey, let's take a field trip to Muir Woods for an afternoon. And I'd never been to Northern California before, so I said, sure. So we went up to Muir Woods, and we took a tour of the environment there. And the guide, or the docent who was taking us around and teaching us about redwoods, told us the story when we were standing in a grove of how one way that redwoods reproduce. Because we saw a circle of trees that was around a stump that had been burned. Probably a lightning strike had taken the tree down. And she called that tree the mother and the circle of daughters, because when a redwood tree, which has burls attached to it, I may be getting this wrong, so apologies to any arborists in the audience, but as I recall, the heat causes the burls to release their seeds, and the trees then grow up around the one that has died, but the roots underneath become intertwined so that the new trees are taking their nutrients from the original one. And it's called the mother tree and the circle of daughters. And so the daughter trees grow up strong and proud, but they are still connected to the mother tree that has died under the surface. And it was such a beautiful metaphor for the experience of losing a mother when you're young, especially, and all the women who I was meeting in the course of writing that book, that it became the epilogue of Motherless Daughters. So, especially if you have a first edition of that book from the 1990s, you can find that story in full in the epilogue. In the most recent edition, it's a little bit earlier in the book now. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to be here today. And thank you to First-Plymouth and Dr. Keck for the opportunity to speak with you this evening, and for recognizing the importance of this topic, one that touches us all. And I'm honored to spend this time with you. I'm imagining that some of you are here tonight because you've experienced a recent loss. And if that's the case, my heart goes straight out to yours tonight, because the acute period of grief right after a loved one dies is one of exquisite tenderness, and all of us are here tonight to hold you gently in that grief. Is there anyone here in that category today? Is there anyone here maybe who's experienced a loss within the first year who'd be willing to share that with us? Oh, quite a few. Okay, so if all of you just look around the room, if you notice someone who had their hand up, can we make that promise to each other to hold these individuals gently tonight? They're in that very tender portion of grief. You know, in Victorian mourning rituals, which were elaborate, you could tell who had lost someone recently, and you could even tell how long ago that loss had occurred. Particularly by the way the women dressed. You went from wearing all black in high mourning to wearing gray in middle mourning to wearing purple or lavender in low mourning as the time between the present and the loss grew. And men wore black armbands. There were wreaths hung on the doors of homes so that there were signals to society and to the population that these are people who have experienced a great loss. Hold them gently in the world while they are going through their process. I imagine that there are others of you who are here tonight because you experienced a loss in the past, maybe even in the distant past, but you still feel the ripple effects of that loss. And you know the nature of the long arc of grief, maybe because you've been traveling on it for quite a while. So I'm wondering how many of you experienced a major loss, a parent, a sibling, a beloved grandparent, or a close friend before the age of 25? How many in the audience? Okay, quite a lot of people. Is there anyone here who lost a parent or a sibling before the age of 20, like myself? Oh, you know, 1 out of 7 Americans experience the loss of a parent or a sibling before they turn 20, and by that show of hands, that kind of looks like it might be about 1/7 of the room, so you all are tracking demographically perfectly. I imagine some of you may be here also because you're anticipating a loss. Maybe you have a loved one who is experiencing terminal illness or is in last stages of dementia. And if that's true, may these next weeks and months be kind to you, and especially to your loved one. And perhaps some of you have not yet experienced a major loss, but are here because someone you know said, hey, I'm going to this event about grief tonight, and I really don't want to go alone. And if this describes you, please know that you are here for that person, but you are also here for your future self, preemptively. Because anyone who's fortunate to live long enough will eventually experience the loss of a loved one. It will happen to everyone, sooner or later. I've been working in the bereavement field for 30 years, and that's a really long time. I've seen some big advancements and changes take place over that period. I got into this work because my mother died in 1981, breast cancer. She was 42 years old. And at that time, society was very much in what I call the dark ages of bereavement, meaning there were no services available for families that had lost a mother and a wife to breast cancer or who had lost a family member to anything. There was no Morning Hope yet, no bereavement centers, no support groups. There wasn't even a hospice yet in the suburb of New York where we lived, which means that there was no support for a father of 3 children, ages 9 to 17, who suddenly found himself as a single parent. And there was no support for those children. I was the oldest of the 3. We were 17, 14, and 9. And we were all left stunned with disbelief and horror that such a thing could and just did happen. I mean, we had neighbors, we had friends, we had a religious community, but we didn't have something that could hold us in our grief, a sense that there were others out there who knew what we were going through. So I was a big reader as a teenager. So I went looking for a book that would tell me what to expect and tell me why I was feeling what I was feeling as a teenager who had lost a mom, who didn't know any other girls who had lost a mom, except my sister. It's pretty rare to be a teenager who loses her mom. So I went looking for a book, and I couldn't find one. Again, it was 1981. I went to college the next year, And for 4 years, I'd go into the library at night after I was done studying or researching, and I'd walk up and down the stacks and pull down books looking for anything about losing a mother when you were young. There were plenty of books for women who were in their 40s or 50s or 60s when their moms died. Plenty of books about father loss, but there was such a vacancy or a vacuum in the literature about my experience that I felt even more isolated with it. I thought, well, maybe it's so incredibly rare that it's not even worth writing about because so few of us experience it. I graduated from college. I went off to my first job, kept looking in bookstores. 3 years later, went to graduate school to study nonfiction writing. Could not find this book anywhere. And I was in a nonfiction writing program at the University of Iowa where I had 2 professors who encouraged me to write this book myself. And I thought, what do I know about writing a book? I have no idea. I was talking this morning at the bereavement center in town at their breakfast, and I had mentioned that I literally went to Prairie Lights bookstore in Iowa City and bought a book called How to Write a Book Proposal. And then I just followed the instructions in it because I didn't really know what I was doing, but I did have this sense that this was an important book. One of my mentors in graduate school, Mary Swander, a poet, nonfiction writer, fiction writer, who was a visiting professor that year, told me or suggested that I go find women to interview. And I thought, well, there's so few of us, where am I going to find women? And she said, just put out the word. So that summer, I was teaching in Evanston, Illinois, in Northwestern University in a summer program. And I remember before the internet how we used to take pieces of paper and put our phone number along the bottom, and there'd be those little strips, and you'd tear it off, and then you'd go home and make a phone call if you were, I don't know, selling a bed or looking to find someone to interview for a book, perhaps. So I made 2 of those. I put one in a cafe in Evanston, another one on the bulletin board in a bookstore, and I left them there, thinking, okay, I had a shared telephone in the dorm that I was living in, and with an answering machine, again, before even voicemail. This would have been 1991. And by the next day, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to know if there was just one other woman out there like me, just one that I might be able to connect with. So I got on my bicycle, and I rode back to the cafe, and I rode back to the bookstore, and I walked in, and it was about 24 hours after I had posted the notices, and every tab had been pulled. What I later learned was that people had pulled it for their wives, for their friends, for their colleagues, and then the calls started coming in. And I spent that summer on my bicycle, biking all over Evanston and Chicago, collecting women's stories on my handheld tape recorders. The first dozen or so of interviews with other women who had lost mothers during childhood and adolescence were absolute game changers for me, because that's when I discovered not only was I not alone with this experience, but there were actually quite a lot of other women out there who had had it. We just weren't talking about it. We had grown up in a time when no one knew how to talk about grief, and it was too painful in most of our families to talk about a mother who had died. So a silence descended on these families, as it did on mine, and the children internalized that message as, this is something we don't talk about. This is something I shouldn't talk about. What happens when something really big has happened to you, and you know it's big, but the adults around you won't talk about it or won't let you or encourage you to talk about it, is that you develop a sense of shame around it. Like, why does this still hurt? Why does this still something I'm carrying with me if no one is acting like it's a big deal? So these women were breaking family silences. They were shedding years, in some cases decades, of shame, and we would sit in cafes and on living room couches and on blankets in their backyards, and their stories just came pouring out of them as if all they'd been waiting for was permission to tell it. Honestly, I would hit record on the tape recorder, and I barely had to say anything for 90 minutes. This story was fully formed inside of them, and they were ready to articulate it.
out loud. It was being in the presence of another person who was willing to bear witness to their story and hold space for its expression that made the difference for them as well as for me. I did not know this yet because I was just getting started on this path of research and writing. But grief has 5 elements that need to be satisfied for optimal healing to occur. And when I say optimal healing, I don't think there's an objective healing that we all can be striving for. Optimal is individual. It relates to the person. You know where your level of optimal functioning is, to get you back there so that you can feel joy again, so that you can engage in life, so that you can find a way to make meaning of your loss. That's what I mean by optimal healing. And to get there, it's best if 5 elements can be satisfied for you. So the first 4 are the intellectual, the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual. And I'll explain each one. The intellectual is how we make sense of a loss. It's how we create a story that feels cognitively complete to us. You notice how sometimes after someone experiences a loss, they want to just keep telling you the story of what happened? They're making sense of that because every time they tell it, it changes just a little bit. And they're trying to find the story that feels complete, that answers the questions that they need to answer so they can feel like they're moving forward. It's called the story development phase. In social psychology, there are actually books written about it. In one of the many hats I wear as nonfiction writing instructor, and I help people tell their stories of loss so we get into that story development phase together. So making meaning out of the loss comes from creating a story that feels complete and acceptable to us. Now, that story can change over time. It often does as we get more information, have more experiences, we grow and mature. But in the beginning, in particular, we're trying to make a story that makes sense to us. Emotionally, emotional support, that emotional element of grief, that is our ability to feel our emotions, to feel safe enough to express them, to be in touch with them. And one-to-one therapy or grief counseling touches on both of those. It helps support a client emotionally and mentally or intellectually. There's also a physical element to grief because grief affects our bodies. It might affect our eating or our sleeping. We might develop symptoms, aches, headaches. So physically, we want to take care of ourselves after a loss to make sure that we are hydrated, that we get exercise, that we're eating well, that we're getting enough sleep. And then there's the spiritual. The spiritual aspect of grief can be satisfied, certainly, by religion and religious community and religious doctrine, but it's also the existential, answering some of the existential questions. Where did this person go? How do I stay connected to them when I'm in the physical world and they're no longer on this plane? A particularly difficult question for children to answer. So you see, when you're thinking about children in particular or teenagers, they're not intellectually or emotionally mature yet. Their bodies are changing. They have big existential questions that they need support from adults to answer. So all of these are true for both children and adults. But then there's a 5th element to grief, and this is where I found my home in terms of my professional life, which is the social element of grief. We are relational beings. We are not meant to grieve alone. And this is why grieving in community, bringing people together, meeting these women for the interviews, writing books that brought women together into support groups has been so essential and so fulfilling for everyone who participates, because you can have those Me Too moments, those thoughts that you have in your head that maybe don't feel normal or don't feel acceptable or feel big or shameful. When you can put them out there in the world and someone can bear witness to them and they don't have the response that you were afraid they might have, you're getting validation, you're getting normalization, and you're getting a form of support. The social aspect of grief is critically important for optimal healing. And to have that satisfied, you need to be in community with compassionate, curious others who are free of judgment or criticism around your loss and around your response to that loss. Well, most people didn't understand any of this in 1981 when my mother died, and they wouldn't for at least a dozen or more years. Back in 1981, when my mom was dying in the hospital at the very end of her life, a social worker pressed a pamphlet into my hand, and on the cover it said, "The 5 Stages of Grief." How many of you have heard of the 5 stages of grief? Probably pretty much everyone by now, right? The 5 stages of grief have been around for quite a while. They grew out of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 1969 book on death and dying. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Those are the 5 stages of grief. Except they were meant to be the 5 stages of dying. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was working with terminally ill patients coming to the end of their lives, and when she interviewed them, she discovered that they went through 5 stages, or that the majority of them went through those 5 stages before the end of their life. Denial, which was first not believing that they could be as sick as their diagnosis revealed. Anger, which was getting mad when they realized they in fact did have this terminal illness. Bargaining was them bargaining with God or with the doctors or with themselves, trying to figure out what they could barter to get back to their optimal health. Depression often set in when they realized that that wasn't going to work. And then ideally, they would reach a phase of acceptance and realize I am coming to the end of my life, this is it. Somewhere along the way, those 5 stages got transferred over to those who were left behind, the survivors of those losses. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Well, we go through, we might have those emotions. We don't necessarily go through it in that order. We don't go through emotions in these kind of neat silos, one by one. They don't always happen in that exact progression. But the 5 stages provided a very seductive model for mourners because 5 is not a lot. It's not a very big number, right? And the 5th one's acceptance, so there's really only 4. I do remember getting that pamphlet when I was a teenager and reading it in the hospital. And the social worker meant well. She was sharing with me the resources that were available at the time. This wasn't a fault of hers by any means, but I took the pamphlet home, and I remember the night of my mother's funeral, sitting on my bed in my bedroom looking at this pamphlet, and I thought, okay, denial? Well, we just buried my mom. I'm not in denial that she died. That would be ludicrous, so check on denial. Anger? I'm not really a very angry person, so I don't think so. Check. Bargaining? Oh, I did that when she was in the hospital. I asked for an exchange. Take me instead of her, please, because the family needs her more. And that didn't work out. So bargaining, I'm past the bargaining phase. There's nothing left to bargain for. Depression? I'm feeling sad, but I wouldn't use the word depressed, so check. Oh, acceptance. That's where I was. This was 48 hours after my mother died. I was convinced that I had sailed through the 5 stages of grief. So they're a seductive model, but they're also a very reductive model because any of you who've lost a loved one, I'm sure know that it doesn't work that way. It's not such a simple progression. In fact, 10 months later, when I was ready to graduate from high school, I was standing in front of the mirror in my cap and gown, and I just kind of fell apart inside. And I remember thinking, if a mother isn't here to watch a daughter graduate from high school, does it really happen? She wasn't there to witness this transition that felt so big at that time in my life. And it hurt so much that I got scared because I thought, oh no, I did those 5 stages wrong. Do I have to go back and do them again? It's too late. It was already, this is a 17-year-old thinking, right? Almost 18 at that point. And I thought I must have gotten grieving wrong, but I didn't tell anybody because I didn't want anyone to know. So it became my secret, and my secret then became my shame. And for many years, I believed that I had grieved wrong. Grief theorists now widely believe that the 5 stages of grief are an outdated model for bereavement, still very relevant in ways for the terminally ill patients, but not so much for those who are mourning. They've since been replaced by what's called a relational model of grief, more commonly known as continuing bonds. And what that means is that we continue to have relations, to stay in relation with our loved ones after they died. That, in fact, this is something that we can aspire to find a way to have a new inner relationship with them moving forward. Psychologists stumbled upon continuing bonds almost by accident, in fact, because there were grief counselors who noticed that their bereaved clients who were having the most trouble were the ones who were coming in and saying, I'm having trouble letting go. I can't move on, I can't let go. That was the language or the vocabulary of the time. This was back in the 1980s and early 90s. They were so distressed, they kept trying to let go of their loved one, whatever that meant to them, and they felt that they couldn't. And brilliant therapist in Adelaide, Australia, by the name of Michael White, who founded narrative therapy, asked his clients, well, what would it look like if instead of saying goodbye to your loved ones, you said hello again? Let's find a way to welcome them back in a new and different way. And it created so much comfort and peace for the survivors of these losses, because they felt like, oh, I don't have to let go, because I didn't want to let go. At around the same time, there were a couple of psychologists over in the Boston area who were studying children after the loss of a parent. It later became the Harvard Child Bereavement Study, which was like the gold standard for quite a while on children's bereavement. But they were interviewing children who had lost a mother or father, and they were seeing that the kids had found ways to stay connected to these parents, whether it was talking to them before they went to sleep or holding on to possessions of them, and still felt that they had a relationship with the lost parent because they hadn't learned yet, or society hadn't taught them yet, that maybe that was not the right way to grieve. So the children really led the way in the development of the theory of continuing bonds, and that is now what much of grief counseling centers around, is helping us find ways, new and different ways, to stay connected to our loved ones once they have left the physical plane. So if you ever wonder what your husband or wife would have done in a present-day situation if they were still alive, or if you talk to your mother or your father out loud in your head, or if you recognize and commemorate your child's birthday or your sibling's date of death every year, it doesn't mean that you're not able to let go or that you're having trouble moving on. It means you have formed, or you are in the process of forming, a new internal relationship with them. It means you're honoring the love that still exists, right? The love that still exists. I think that's what grief is. That's the best definition of grief I've come across in 30 years. I lead 4-day retreats for motherless daughters several times a year, for women who were up to age 18 when their moms died, and for women who were 19 to 30. We look at the coping strategies they developed to manage growing up without a mom, and which of those strategies are still working for them today, and which ones maybe have outlived their usefulness and are ready to let go of. And I hear quite frequently from these daughters, especially those who were young when their mothers died, the statement, I never grieved my mother. They come to a retreat because they feel they didn't properly grieve their mother at the time of loss. And they've been carrying a sense of deficiency or shame, as if not grieving their mother meant they didn't love her or they didn't miss her. And when I hear a woman say, I never grieved my mother, my first question is always, what did you expect grief to look like? And most often, it's the Hollywood version of grief. It's crying, it's lamenting, it's talking. Well, not everybody grieves that way. There are what have been called in the past female pattern and male pattern grief. There are now new terms for them, but one is an instrumental form of grief. It is problem-solving grief. It's grieving by doing. And the other one is grieving by emoting. And we all tend to think of grief, for the most part, as the emoting form of grief, where people are visibly distressed. So if these women don't remember showing signs of visible distress when they were young, they think they didn't grieve their moms. So we talk about how they expected grief to look and where those expectations came from, because they're often a result of the culture that you live in. Grief is very culturally relative. My next question for them is, what were the first couple of weeks or months after the death like for you? Why don't you walk me through what you remember doing or thinking or feeling during that time? And they might say, well, I withdrew into my room and I listened to music up loud, or I changed my friend group, or I dyed my hair purple. And then my third question for them is, would you be surprised to know that those are grief responses too? In fact, almost any behavior after a loved one dies is in response to that loss, and we can consider it a grief response. Even distracting yourself or suppressing your emotions or refusing to talk can be a grief response. In fact, what looks like the opposite of grief is typically and usually some form of grief response. It was how little you or middle-aged you or present-day you shows up to manage the level of distress that you're feeling at that time, especially if you don't have social support. We have a saying at Motherless Daughters that everyone grieves to the best of their ability at the time of loss. And for some people, that ability is very limited, especially children who are dependent on the adults around them to support them through their grief process. And especially for adults who are overwhelmed by their emotions, maybe by the practical tasks that they have to tend to in the aftermath of a loss, and perhaps don't know where to turn or where to go or who to ask for help. And that's why grief centers and programs like the one you have here at Morning Hope and the community that you have here at First-Plymouth are so essential, because we are not meant to grieve alone. Grieving hurts, and grieving alone hurts even more. So everything I've said so far is very relevant in the immediate aftermath of a loss. But I'd also like to talk with you tonight about the long-term journey that a mourner embarks on, which is what I call the long arc of loss. And this is also what I call the after grief, which is the title of my most recent book. It's the part of bereavement that comes after the acute phase of pain. I call the after grief Motherless Daughters for Grown-ups, because I wrote it so many years after my mom had died, but still felt that in many ways I still from time to time was grieving that loss and her absence. So the after grief is the part that just keeps on going and going and going. It's the part in which we still miss our loved one, we still think about them often, we still wish they were here, but the chronic emotional pain of that acute period has started to abate. People ask me, well, when does the after grief start? Like, I'm in a lot of pain right now. Tell me when the after grief is coming so I can be ready and I can make plans for it. And I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer, because grief is way too individual for that. It depends on who you lost, what your relationship was like with them, what other factors are in your life right now, how they died, also if it was a traumatic loss. What I say is that you will know when you cross the threshold. It might be the first time you laugh again, or the first morning when you wake up and feel grateful for the sun and for birdsong outside, or the first time that you can tell a story about your loved one without tearing up and needing to leave the room. Only you will know when you've arrived there. But if I were to give you a general guideline, I'd say anywhere between 6 months to 2 years. Again, depending on who died, how they died, the nature of the relationship. But again, it's just too individual to predict in advance. Entering what I call the after grief Does this mean you stop missing your loved one? No. You will still think about them, of course, long for them from time to time, and you'll feel the urge to talk about them, and there will be times when what we call grief spikes occur and often take you by surprise. In the after grief, I distinguish between what I call new grief, old grief, and new old grief. I'm going to explain each one for you briefly, and hopefully this will contextualize some of your experiences, past or present. New grief is that acute phase. It's what we feel right after somebody dies, and it's very person or situation specific. You are grieving or hurting because that particular person or that situation doesn't exist for you anymore. Old grief happens later. Old grief shows up. It's a reaction in the present to a loss that was in the past. So this can be an anniversary event, like feeling really weepy on your spouse's birthday or the anniversary of a child's death. It can happen also in what we call sneak attacks, when a song comes on the radio that you weren't expecting, or you see someone wearing your brother's favorite hat, and you feel that, missing them again. That would fall under the category of old grief. Or it can be reactivated grief that is due to a present-day loss. For example, in the population of women I work with, the death of a father or the end of a relationship, like a divorce, reactivates grief for the mother who died when they were young, and they find themselves missing their moms again, often missing her comfort or her support or her advice. Or maybe it's the birthday when your child would have turned 30. That's another example of old grief. It is a present-day reaction to a loss that occurred in the past. But then there's this other category that I call new old grief. It's when an old loss, you have a present-day reaction to an old loss showing up in a completely new and different way that you weren't expecting and maybe didn't even know to plan for. And we see this happening at one-time events, like especially times of transition, like shopping for a wedding dress without your mom, or becoming a father without your father alive, or reaching and passing a sibling or a parent's age at time of death. Ooh, that's a big one. In the Motherless Daughters community, we call that crossing the silent threshold. It is such a significant transition for these women to outlive their mother's ages, but there's no societal ritual or even acknowledgement of it when it happens. But I can tell you, they know, they're aware of it. Sometimes they've counted to the day, not just when they're 1 year older than their mom, in counting numbers, but when they have crossed and been on earth for more days than their mother got to live. The key feature of new old grief, kind of the insidious thing about it, is that it can't be experienced until the moment arrives. Here's an example for you. So I was 17 when my mom died. I was 17. What did I know about being a mom? Not much. When I was 32, I got pregnant with my first child, and I went through the pregnancy, and yeah, I missed my mom. I did, and I knew to expect that. I'd been researching and writing mother loss for a couple years by then, and I'd heard enough stories that I knew that this was going to be maybe a little bumpier transition for me than it would be for other women. But I couldn't pre-grieve what it was going to be like to be a mother without a mother. I could not feel that and experience that emotion until after my daughter was born and I was holding her in my arms. And I was so, so sad. I was sad that my mother didn't get to meet her first grandchild. I was sad that this grandchild would never get to meet her maternal grandmother. I was frankly pissed off that all my friends had their mothers there to help them after their babies were born, and I was doing it either by myself or with whoever I could afford to pay. to help me. I didn't have anyone to watch my daughter for weekends, for a getaway, or to call for advice in the middle of the night if she woke up with a fever and I didn't know what to do. So all of that I could only feel when she was born. I couldn't even grieve it in an anticipatory way the week before her birth. It was only after. So that's an example of new old grief. And I imagine that some of you have had those experiences yourself, and perhaps we can talk about them later. They may come up in the Q&A, or feel free to talk with me when I'm sitting in the back after as well. What I hope to impress on you this evening, because I think I'm coming to the end of my time here, and what I'd like to end on, is the reminder that if you still miss your person who died, if it's been years or even decades after they've died, there's nothing wrong with you. My mom now died 43 years ago. I still think about her all the time. I still tear up sometimes thinking about what she missed. I realize now how young that was. When I was 17, it was like, oh, 42. She went to college, she got married, she had kids, she was old. She did all these things that seemed so distant and unattainable to me at that age. And then I turned 42, which was a really weird year for me. But 43, that was even weirder, being older than my mom got to be. So now I'm 59. I have lived a lot of years beyond my mom, and I realized she only got half a life. And that sometimes will still bring me to my knees to realize that. So if you still feel the same way, if you still miss your person, if you're still brought to tears decades after they've died, there is nothing wrong with you. Nothing at all. It doesn't mean you didn't grieve properly. It doesn't mean you weren't able to let go. It means you're doing grief the way pretty much everyone does it, which is continuing to feel love for your person even after they're no longer present in the physical world. Grief, like I said, has been described as the love that remains. So let's take that with us. It's the love that remains. Grief is love. Marissa Renee Lee has a beautiful book that came out about a year or two ago called Grief is Love. I completely agree. So I invite you all to join me in spreading that word, in standing up against the pathologizing of a completely normal human experience. And by doing so, we will be helping to create a more grief literate society for everyone. Thank you very much. Oh, is this me?
Boy, thank you, Hope. Let me just take a few moments and talk with you. I just want to give pause on that last line you spoke was so nice. I feel like I'm jumping over it. Say it one more time about the love that remains.
That grief is the love that remains.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was reading your writing, one thing I so appreciated was how you emphasized first that it's also individual, and that it's longer than we might think. Because it seems like you bring such a compassion. We judge ourselves so much on both of those. I'm not following some model right, and I'm not getting over it fast
enough.
So I just wanted to thank you for that spirit throughout the book. But I get great satisfaction, I don't know why, of discovering all the ways that Freud was wrong. Could you tell me how Freud was wrong about grief?
Yes, I can. Actually, we can do a fast dive into history because the development of psychoanalysis and Freud's paper, his 1917 paper called Mourning and Melancholia, created a big shift in the thinking around grief and how we would experience it. It was actually World War I, Freud's paper, and the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 that changed grief behavior in the Western world.
All the people that suddenly had to mourn.
Right, that's right. You couldn't keep up those Victorian mourning rituals when people were dying far from home and buried in Europe on the field, or were 2 or 3 people were dying in close temporal proximity to each other, and so it kind of fell apart, mourning behaviors. But what Freud did was he portrayed mourning as an individual interior experience. Until that time, the village used to come together to mourn the passing of one of its own. It was a very social experience. The body would be laid out at the home, visitors would come there. So also around the same time, death was being moved into a hospital, and funeral practices were being moved into mortuaries and funeral homes and hidden away, exactly, hidden away. So, but Freud, we'll get back to Freud, depicted grief as an internal process of psychically relinquishing your ties to the loved one, and then taking back that energy to yourself, and then eventually attaching it to somebody else.
So let that go, find something else to love.
Right, okay, works with a relationship breakup or a divorce, right? You have to let go of your emotional attachment to that person. You know, the sort of like the word out there is you know, build yourself back up again, build up your own self-esteem, and then find a new partner and attach to them. Okay, it works in that regard, but for a child who's lost a mother, or an adult who's lost a child, I mean, it doesn't work that way. Yeah. The thing is, Freud discovered it didn't work that way when his daughter Sophie died from the Spanish flu pandemic in 1919, and even wrote a letter saying that he still felt very much attached to her, and disproved his own theory. It was only a theory, but by then, you know, it's like the horses were out of the gate. It was like the 5 stages of grief. Once, you know, the larger community got hold of this idea and took it, they started developing, and it was, Freud couldn't get it back, the same way that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross couldn't take the 5 stages back and say, no, they're meant to be applied to the dying, not the mourners.
Isn't there a new book out about 3 famous philosophers or psychologists that lost a child and how it changed them? Have you seen that?
No, I don't know.
I think it just came out, actually.
Okay.
Well, so take me to the person next to someone grieving. What are the ways that we can really blow it when we're alongside someone grieving?
Well, there's a couple things to not do.
Yeah.
One is to say, oh gosh, you know, I can really relate to how you're feeling because ... my, you know, grandmother died when I was 12, which is not the same thing as losing a sibling when you're 20, for example. You know, it's trying to compare.
And we're not the same people, so it's never, even if the circumstance was the same, it's not the same.
Any sentence that begins with the words "at least" should be erased from
at least
the vocabulary. At least she didn't suffer. At least he got to say goodbye. It's not comforting for a mourner to hear that very often. Really, what we can do is just let them know that we are a safe place for them to come and express their emotional pain when and how they need to.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple, but it often feels threatening. Yeah. Because those who are around the mourners often feel inadequate or feel uncomfortable. So really what we need to do is just get over our own we selves and be there for the people that we care about.
Yeah. You know, so what age I was in the 80s made Joseph Campbell a major hero for me spiritually, the great mythologist and symbolist. And of course, his first and most famous book was The Monomyth. There's one particular story we love, and the hero's journey, and that hero's journey became sort of the story that made me understand the spiritual process and the religious life itself. You know, the hero's journey, where you have to leave the known and enter the unknown and face these challenges, and if you can somehow overcome these challenges, you return wiser and stronger. You're the hero. And that became such a beloved story, but I know that you think that's not a very good story for grief, and that when you wrote that, it was insightful to me. Could you describe why that's maybe not always the best story for grief?
Well, you know, it's a familiar story arc. And it implies that we will find the magic elixir that we can bring back to ourselves or our families or our communities. And I think it sets up expectations that we can go out a long distance and then come back to where we began. And anyone who's lost a loved one knows there's no real going back. There is only going forward in a different way. So I think of that monomyth as, which is kind of circular, you come back to where you began, but you're changed. I think you're moving forward, changed.
Yeah, there was a line, I think you quote, grief is not about get over it, it's move on with it. Is that the right line?
Yeah, it's how to carry it, how to carry it forward.
Yeah.
And to let it change us, because the changes that grief can affect in us are not, monolithically negative. Yeah. They are often actually for the, I want to say for the better, but that does not mean to imply in any way that we should be grateful that a loved one died. I work with the principles of narrative therapy, which is about creating alternative preferred narratives to carry forward. So when I'm working with my clients or the women at the retreats, I say, you have a story of loss that is deeply painful. We will not take that story away from you. That story is not false. But are you letting that story define you? And if that's the story that's defining you, that's a hard story to carry forward. Let's also look at the ways in which you grew and changed for the positive as a result of this loss. Let's look at the cause and effect chain that was set in motion by the death of your loved one. As a result, this happened, and then that happened, and then this happened. All these things that never would have otherwise happened. Did they lead to some good things in your life that couldn't have happened otherwise? That is carrying a second narrative side by side with the first one to help balance it out.
Yeah, and to keep finding ways to say hello again to that relationship.
Exactly.
So I know we're nearing the end of our time, but when you look, you said it needs to be a social phenomenon rather than this individual process. Would there be anything you'd wish for about how schools and workplaces and churches would deal with it better? I didn't want to say the word better, but you know what I mean.
There are lots of individuals and initiatives doing terrific work right now in the workplace and in schools to help teachers and administrators and managers become more grief-informed. I mean, one thing we can do is extend bereavement leave beyond 3 days in most workplaces. I don't know how many of you...
I see a lot of nods
out
there right
this second. 3 days for bereavement leave, but my gosh, in some cultures that's not even enough time to go through your rituals. And that is inadequate for a vast group of Americans.
Absolutely. Well, I said I take delight when Freud is wrong. Have you seen ministers really blow it?
Have I seen ministers really blow it? I have heard stories from women whose priests or ministers have said things that were not helpful. But I have not personally witnessed a minister blow it, and I hope that tonight will not be the first time. I'm sure it won't be.
Good response. I know we have to end, but I appreciate hearing you flesh some of this more out. We do like to have models in our mind, and I believe you proposed a ring model at one point in your writing as a helpful model. Is there a way for you to describe that?
Oh, sure. I was thinking about what model of bereavement does feel true to all the people I met. When I was writing The After Grief, I interviewed men and women who had lost a mother, a father, a sibling, or a close friend or partner before their mid to late 20s. Thinking that was the parameter for what we would call early loss. Typically before 29 is considered early. And so I listened to all of their stories and I thought, what model adequately represents what I'm hearing from them along the long arc of grief? And what I came up with was a model I call the rings of grief. And so I invite you to imagine the Target store logo, the bullseye, where there's a circle in the middle and then there's 2 rings around it. And that circle in the middle is what I call the hot core of grief. That's the acute grief phase where new grief is experienced when someone has just died. And then the ring around it is, I feel like, where we start expanding back into our daily lives, just our regular average existence. That's the middle ring. And we'll function there. Most of the time, it's the ring of optimal functioning, except sometimes there'll be a sneak attack, or old grief will come up, our new old grief, and we'll shrink back into the middle and have those feelings again. And then typically we won't be there for as long, and it won't feel so intense over time. We'll come back out to that middle ring. But the third ring, the outer ring, is a ring that represents what in psychology is called post-traumatic growth, which is where we find real deeper meaning and purpose in our lives. And so sometimes, hopefully you'll expand into that third ring.
So the grief stays the same size, but your life and growth get bigger.
Exactly. Right. There is a beautiful model of a ball inside a jar, and it shows a ball inside like a mason jar, and it says, we believe that this is how grief looks. And in the first jar, the ball's about that big. In the next jar, it shrinks, and in the third jar, it's a small ball. That's how we expect grief to behave. But instead, it's more like this, and it shows the same jar with the same ball, and the next graphic is a bigger jar, and the third graphic is an even bigger jar. Life gets bigger around it.
So I do hope for all of us as we hold our grief that you're experiencing
an expanse of life.
Expansion, that's the way to put it.
An expanse of life,
It's,
not necessarily in spite of your grief,
No,
but also because of it.
Because of it. Well, so Hope, thank you so much. Hope is going to be, Addie, I believe, in the chapel for signing books. Yes, in the chapel to sign books. Also, I want to thank Morning Hope for being a co-sponsor. There's also After Grief copies from the bookstore. Let me also mention that on May 2nd we have another lecturer on dignity, a professor from Harvard, coming on May 2nd at 7 p.m. So look for that. But Hope, you've been a gift to us tonight, and you've.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you for the
Hope
opportunity.
Watch your step here.
Okay.
I'll take her to the chapel. You can.
This is a song called Solstice. On the first eve of summer, in the tossing of a dream, came a loon's call at twilight, in a half-tone harmony. I miss you, my wild and roaming spring, sun heavy in the trees, lilacs setting in the east. In the fire it cracked and crumbled, our bellies filled with wine. Smoke signals rose in spirals, a cotton string unwinding. I need to Clouds look like cherry blossoms drifting west until they're gone. Come back, please, my wild and roaming spring. I miss you.